Good evening and welcome to St Paul's Wimbledon Park on this last Sunday before Advent. Welcome to the first of our series of Sunday evening Advent sessions. You will note that we are changing the order of these slightly, that instead of starting with Kevin Jones's talk about Holman Hunt's famous picture, the Light of the World, we are now going to have that as the last of the series, so that'll be on December the 13th. Instead, tonight, we've got Norman Allen, who's going to talk about the famous German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We are, after the session, going to have a Zoom session so that we can have a chat and have any questions and answers and discussion about it. The details of how to access the Zoom session are on the website. But now I'm very pleased to be able to hand over to Norman to talk about Bonhoeffer. Thank you.
I'm sure you've noticed, but we live in uncertain times. The political scene, marred by the onset of the truth decay, challenges our trust in authority, whilst the pandemic highlights our fragile mortality, when so many lives have been interrupted before their fulfillment, whatever fulfillment may mean. But is a life, any life, best measured by a tally of years, or by the quality of their contribution to the world they briefly visited? One of my heroes is George Herbert, the 17th century scholar, courtier, poet, musician, and country parson, who died aged just 39. But that's another story. In the 20th century, another scholar, poet, theologian, statesman, musician, and priest has had a lasting reputation and impact on more recent history. He also died aged 39 in April 1945. Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer would have had so much to contribute to post-World War II theology and international reconciliation. He is well remembered as one of the 12 20th century martyrs, the stone figures above the west door of Westminster Abbey. Dietrich served in many roles as a pastor, a teacher, a secret agent, prophet, and eventually as a martyr, executed on Hitler's own orders at Flossenbürg prison on the 9th of April 1945, just a few days before the final collapse of the Third Reich. So ended the life of a brilliant theologian, an internationally renowned churchman who had so much impact on 20th century religious thinking, and whose resolute example reflects much credit on those who resisted the evil of the Nazi regime. Dietrich came from a prosperous agnostic family that lived initially in Breslau, now in Poland, before moving to Berlin, where his father was an eminent psychiatrist, and he was part of a large, happy family and had many influential friends in non-Nazi establishment circles. Young Dietrich could well have thrived in one of several careers, in medicine, in music, philosophy, or the law. However, he chose to study theology at Tübingen University and was ordained into the Lutheran Church. After pastoring a German congregation in Barcelona, he studied in New York before becoming a lecturer at Berlin University. His promising career was disrupted by the election of Adolf Hitler in 1933, when he publicly opposed the Nazi Führerprinzip. He moved to London, nearby, to pastor the German Lutheran congregation. His church in Forest Hill still keeps his memory alive by holding an annual Bonhoeffer study day with appropriate music. I attended on the 1st of February this year, when the theme was Bonhoeffer for the Future. Bonhoeffer was an accomplished musician, influenced by a wide variety of classical and modern composers, including his own brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi. Music supported his spirituality, especially in Tegel prison, where he was allowed the piano. For 6 years during the 1970s, we lived very near Bonhoeffer's home in Marienburger Allee on the edge of the Grunewald. However, it's only since leaving Berlin that I have become interested in his life and his contribution to modern Christianity. When I visited Marienburger Allee in 2017 with Bishop Christopher, we were much moved to hear Bach played on Dietrich's own harpsichord in his bedroom at the top of the house. Bonhoeffer was among several prominent German theologians who opposed the Nazi regime and the usurpation of the Protestant churches, when some pastors taught that Jesus was, of course, an Aryan. With Martin Niemöller and Karl Barth and others, they established the German Confessing Church to counter the official German Christian churches, those which supported, or at least acquiesced, to the Nazi supervision. The Barmen Declaration of 1934 laid down firm articles against distorting the Christian gospel, distorting the gospel for political ends. However, they were not accepted by many Lutherans, perhaps because the pastors owed their livings to the church tax, their stipends being administered by the state. The dramatic rise of the Third Reich highlights uneasy relationships between religion and the state. Hitler appointed a foul-mouthed former naval chaplain, Paul Müller, as his stooge to be the Reich Bischof, the equivalent of the Archbishop of Canterbury. German Christians faced a dilemma. Should the religious voice follow St. Paul's dictum of obeying the state, of towing the Roman line? But as a persecuted minority, the early Christians had little choice. Should the state be supported even when it lacks a moral compass, when it has neglected basic truths, to live by deafening slogans, failing to serve all its people? Or perhaps when the state and religion are one, as in a reactionary theocracy, or when the state adopts a religious guise to justify oppression, as in modern Iran. These are, of course, difficult issues, and Bonhoeffer wrestled with his conscience as he opposed the Third Reich. These are live issues today. What is the role of the Church when it sees suffering of minorities, when government lacks moral principles, and the official opposition struggles to project authority or alternative policies? Should the Church stand back, wringing its hands, or join in the fray? We are fortunate to live in a democracy with free media, incorruptible judiciary, and some religious leaders who are ready to challenge the government. But then religious leaders have been reluctant to root out their own black sheep, lest they mar their own piety and reputations, as been recently but belatedly revealed, when so many have suffered without recognition or recompense. In his book of 1937, The Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer wrote, "Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ. Whereas costly grace is costly because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives man the only true life, a dictum that Bonhoeffer followed to the very end. During the mid-1930s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer led an unofficial seminary until it was shut down. However, he continued to teach students illegally. In 1939, during a lecture tour of the United States, he was offered several prestigious teaching posts. However, despite being a prominent opponent of the Nazis, he chose to return to Germany just before the war was declared, to support the confessing church. He managed to avoid the army with the aid of Admiral Canaris, who was then the head of naval intelligence and also a resistor. He employed Bonhoeffer as a double agent. Originally, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pacifist, but he soon became involved in the resistance to be part of the network planning to assassinate Hitler. And during his time working with Admiral Canaris, he made several trips to Switzerland, to Italy, to Norway, and to Stockholm, where he had important conversations with Bishop George Bell on his quasi-diplomatic missions from Chichester. On the 5th of April 1943, Bonhoeffer was arrested for aiding the escape of some Jews to Switzerland. He was thought to be involved somehow with the resistance, but there was no hard evidence to implicate him in the plot against Hitler, the plot which failed when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to kill Hitler on the 20th of July 1943. Bonhoeffer was first imprisoned at Tegel prison in Berlin, where he was treated quite liberally. He was permitted visits by his family and his fiancée, to write and to carry out lively correspondence with all he knew. Later, he was held more severely in an underground cell by the Gestapo before being sent to Buchenwald, the concentration camp. Many of these letters and papers have since been published to give penetrating insights into his mind and his circumstances. Bonhoeffer's writings have had a deep influence in post-war theology. Having written several books, he never completed his magnum opus, but his Ethics has since been published posthumously in 1949, based upon his copious notes. The modern world tends to neglect ethics, yet we lose sight of the moral science for the right conduct of civilized society at our peril. The golden rule of do as you would done by, as Giles Fraser wrote, ethics is a state of solidarity with other human beings, reminding us, of course, of the golden rule, that we all belong to one another. Bonhoeffer lived and he died with fervent hope in God's eternal grace. Early on his morning, the final morning at Flossenburg, the camp doctor, Fischer Holström, reported seeing Pastor Bonhoeffer praying in his cell. I was most deeply moved by the way this most lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. Together with the other resistance leaders, Admiral Canaris, Generals Oster and Thomas, and Judge Sack, he was swiftly executed, and their bodies were burned in the primitive crematorium oven. It's still there, adjacent to landscaped ash heaps and several memorials. It's a very moving place to visit. Bonhoeffer died and lived with the fervent hope in God's eternal grace, demonstrating the very heavy cost of discipleship. He made his final journey from Buchenwald in a ramshackle bus, and the prisoners spent the night in the schoolhouse at Schönberg, where there were a few guards to keep them there. As a former soldier, I often wonder, why did he not try to escape? But then he was following Jesus, the Christ who did not attempt to escape from his destiny in the Garden of Gethsemane. As I said earlier, during the early 30s, when Bonhoeffer pastored the German church at Forest Hill, he was assisted by Jürgen Winterhager, one of his students, and they met Bishop George Bell, beginning their important friendships. At that time, Bishop Bell was a very influential international churchman, statesman, and theologian. However, he upset politicians by his outspoken truth to power. He has since been remarked as the best Archbishop of Canterbury we never had. Sadly, his memory has since been tainted by a vague, unsupported allegation of misconduct. In 1974, I invited Pastor Jürgen Winterhager to talk to my soldiers in the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. He spoke very movingly of his release after 2 years in a Stasi prison, where he had been confined in an underground cell for his crime, the crime of preaching to a congregation of more than 12. His identity was erased to be replaced by a number. One day, the Stasi prison governor came to him with a copy of the London Times, pointing out a letter from Bishop Bell, which said, "My good friend Pastor Jürgen Winterhager has disappeared. Does anyone know where he is?" When prisoner 454098 was required to translate the English letter, he said, "But this man does not exist. He is only a number." Realizing that prisoner 544098 was significant in the West, the communists expelled him to West Berlin. Jürgen Winterhager was a lovely, saintly old man. I often regret not asking him about his friendships with George Bell and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Shortly before his death, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote from prison this hymn of hope, hope that sums up his faith. By gracious paths so wonderfully sheltered, and confidently waiting come what may, we know that God is with us night and morning, and never fails to greet us each new day. We know that God is with us night and morning, and never fails to greet us each new day. Yet are our hearts by their old foe tormented, still evil days bring burdens hard to bear. O give our frightened souls the sure salvation, for which, O God, you taught us to prepare. O give our frightened souls the sure salvation, for which, O God, you taught us to prepare. And when this cup you give is filled to brimming, with bitter suffering hard to understand, we take it gladly, trusting though with trembling, out of so good and so beloved a hand. We take it gladly, trusting though with trembling, out of so good and so beloved a hand. If once again in this mixed world you give us the joy we had, the brightness of the sun, we shall recall what we have learned in sorrow, and dedicate our lives to you alone. We shall recall what we have learned in sorrow, and dedicate our lives to you alone. Pastor Bernd Rapp invited me to attend Bonhoeffer's 75th Memorial Eucharist at the German church in Forest Hill last April, but the first lockdown intervened. However, we may remember Pastor Bonhoeffer in spirit by praying this, his prayer. God, I call you early in the morning. Help me to pray and gather my thoughts. I cannot do it alone. Father in heaven, praise and thanks be to you for the rest of the night. Praise and thanks be to you for the new day. Praise and thanks be to you for all your love and faithfulness in my past life. You have shown me many good things. Let me now also accept hard things from your hand. You will not place on me more than I can bear. You make all things serve your children for the best. Amen. I hope you will join me later on Zoom. Thank you for listening.